You think my mom's dead? The boy said with a grin. Then you really don't know who you just kidnapped. The cage stank of rust, bile, and alien panic. Eli sat cross-legged on the cold floor of his holding cell, his wrists locked in electric restraints that hummed with low-frequency pulses. Every few seconds, one of the Drozari guards would glance at him through the energy bars with a mixture of disgust and fear, like he was some kind of exotic pet that had just hissed. He didn't flinch. He didn't beg. He didn't ask for water. He just watched them, like he was collecting their faces for something he hadn't yet told them about. The ship was old, patched together with leftover tech from 3 different species. Screams from other cages echoed through the ventilation shafts. Somewhere behind him, an alien child sobbed in a language Eli didn't know. He exhaled slowly and tightened his grip on the memory of his mother's voice. The Drozari auctioneer, a gray-scaled brute with mechanical eyes and a translator grafted into his neck, strutted across the auction platform like he was hosting some sick variety show. A camera drone buzzed around him, transmitting his voice to a dozen screens in shadowy sectors of the galaxy. Behind him stood a row of caged children and teens from different worlds, most trembling. When it was Eli's turn, the gate opened with a hiss, and the guard shoved him forward. "What do we have here?" the announcer bellowed, his voice booming in synthetic tones. "A real treat from the dirt ball called Earth. Fully organic. No cybernetics. Completely pure." The crowd roared with laughter. A buyer from the Trillion Consortium offered 5,000 credits just for the novelty of a human. Another asked if he'd make a good pet for her daughter. Eli said nothing, just stood barefoot on the platform in his torn shirt, his brown hair tangled and his face bruised but steady. The slaver leaned in. "Speak, boy. Tell them your name." Eli shrugged. "Eli Kale." That got some snickers, but not much else. The auctioneer gave a mock bow. "How adorable. Kale. Like the burnt-out Kale shipyards." He turned to the bidders. "A joke name, perhaps?" Eli tilted his head, looked the slaver dead in his good eye, and said, "You didn't ask for my mother's name." That made the auctioneer pause. "Fine. Let's have it." Eli didn't raise his voice. Didn't blink. "Riven Kale." The silence was immediate. Not the kind that builds. The kind that slams down like a dropped wall. The alien bidders froze. The auctioneer's mechanical eye twitched. One of the guards actually stepped back from the edge of the stage. A slow ripple of recognition moved through the slaver crew like the whisper of a cold wind through broken glass. The name had weight, and the ship's entire mood shifted under it. "No," someone muttered. "Impossible," another said, already backing away. The announcer tried to recover. "Riven Kale is dead." Eli smiled for the first time in hours. "You sure?" The screen went black. The feed was cut. Lights flickered. In the silence, the Drozari guards hauled Eli off the platform and down the corridor, muttering and hissing in rapid, panicked speech. They didn't beat him this time. They didn't even make eye contact. Instead of throwing him back in the shared cells, they placed him in a reinforced isolation pod. As the door hissed shut, one of the guards turned to the other and whispered, "What if it's true? What if that's her blood?" In the dark, Eli lay down on the cot and stared at the ceiling. He didn't cry. He just whispered, "Mom, I hope you saw that." Thousands of kilometers away, in a moonless sector of dead space, a black stealth ship rumbled to life. The AI core, Talon, chirped as it completed a data packet sweep. The captain stood over the console, watching a flickering replay of the auction feed. Her face, shadowed beneath a battle helmet, was emotionless. But her hand, clad in reinforced armor, clenched so hard that the metal joints cracked. She rewound the video. Replayed the moment her son said her name. "Captain," Talon said gently. "If you engage this course, it's war. Are you certain?" The woman didn't speak for a long moment. Then she leaned forward, typed a set of override commands, and armed the ship's full strike capabilities. "They touched my son." "Yes, ma'am." The ship launched into warp, its engines almost silent. Inside, the walls were covered in weapons she hadn't used in 5 years. Grenade belts, sonic hammers, magnetic charges, plasma blades. She opened a storage locker and pulled out her old combat suit, the one that made entire squads surrender just by recognizing the insignia. She locked it on, piece by piece, sealing away whatever part of her had tried to live a quiet life. As the ship burned toward the slaver coordinates, Talon pulled up historical files on the Drozari Syndicate. 8 planets, 3 transport lanes, at least 4 auction ships. Riven Kale stared at the map with the cold focus of a surgeon prepping for an autopsy. One stop at a time, she whispered. Back on the slaver frigate, the Drozari were in chaos. Some wanted to kill Eli to erase the evidence. Others warned that would only guarantee their deaths. One even suggested spacing him, jettisoning him out an airlock so the body would never be found. The captain of the vessel, a sneering brute with triple armored plating and rust-stained claws, dismissed them all. "She's dead," he growled. "And even if she isn't, we've crossed worse." One of his lieutenants handed him a data pad. It displayed a list of known victims tied to the name Riven Kale. The file had to be scrolled, twice. The captain's mandibles twitched. He dropped the pad. "Triple the patrols. Lock the nav prep for silent warp. No signals in or out. But the buyers. Forget the buyers. This just became survival." In his isolation cell, Eli pressed his ear to the wall, listening to the muffled arguments. Then he laughed quietly. Not the laugh of a scared child. The laugh of someone who knew the monsters were finally afraid. He looked at his glowing shackles, then at the red light blinking in the corner of the ceiling. He gave it a little wave. "Hi, Mom." The ship moved like a ghost through space, silent, undetectable, and deadly. Its hull was coated in adaptive alloys that bent light and scattered sensors. It didn't broadcast a signal, didn't respond to hails, and didn't exist in any official registry. Somewhere deep in its command center stood a woman whose name had once sparked fear across entire sectors. Riven Kale, the ghost of the battlefield, the shadow that moved before planetary blackouts. And now, her son had been taken. That single act had undone 5 years of silence, erased every reason she had to hide, and summoned a storm no one in the Drozari Syndicate was ready for. Talon's voice cut through the low hum of the ship's systems. "Approaching last known coordinates of Drozari slave frigate designation GH-91. Scans indicate altered transponder codes and inactive distress beacon. Likely cloaked within asteroid belt 9X. Riven leaned forward, fingers dancing across the control panel. She zoomed in on a field of fractured rock and metallic debris. Somewhere in there, the ship was hiding, hoping its silence would mask the crime already committed. She wasn't going to let that happen. She pulled up the intercepted auction footage again, frame by frame. Her son's face appeared bruised but calm. Eli had always been stubborn. Quiet, observant, but fierce under pressure. The last time she trained with him, he'd outwitted a drone ambush she'd spent 2 hours programming. She had thought a quiet life would be enough for him. Maybe she had been wrong. Maybe it wasn't in his blood to be safe. Maybe it wasn't in hers either. She ran diagnostics on the ship's weapons systems. Plasma torpedoes charged. Hull-piercing javelins ready. Magnetic EMP mines locked and loaded. Every inch of the craft had been built for the kind of warfare outlawed by most treaties. The kind of war she used to wage under the banner of peace. Now, she flew for no flag. No command. No forgiveness. Just the boy who'd looked into a camera and said her name like it was a threat. Inside the slaver's ship, the atmosphere was thick with fear. Guards patrolled faster, twitchier. The captain, a lumbering brute named Kravik, was already considering abandoning the boy altogether. Eli sat cross-legged in his isolated chamber, watching through the small viewport as the crew scrambled and argued. They didn't know she was already here. She always moved before the first alarm sounded. That was her style. Eli knew the stories. He'd read them in redacted military files she didn't know he could access. She had taken out an entire battalion on a moon base without leaving a single print. Once, she triggered 5 planetary blackouts simultaneously to crash an Empire's war budget. And now she was coming for him. Talon activated internal comms. Target vessel located. Initiating cloaked approach vector. Do you want to send a message? Riven didn't answer immediately. Then she spoke cold and clear. No warning. She locked into a hard trajectory, steering toward the slaver ship's blind spot. Her ship slid past unmanned satellites and asteroid clusters until it hovered just beneath the frigate's belly, less than 50 meters from the hull. Talon disengaged main power, keeping only the magnetic grapplers active. Riven pulled a javelin from the weapons rack, checked its edge, and slung it onto her back. Then she opened the hatch. Vacuum rushed past her, but her suit held firm. She launched across space with pinpoint thruster bursts, crossing the distance like a bullet. She landed with no sound on the slaver hull and attached a spike to override the external airlock. Inside, alarms began to beep. A security officer looked up from his console, and then the lights went out. Not flickered. Not dimmed. They died. Total blackout. Kravik roared orders, but his voice was swallowed by chaos. Flashlights activated. Doors locked. Security bots malfunctioned. Static poured through the intercom. Somewhere deep in the ship, footsteps echoed where no footsteps should have been. One by one, guards vanished from their posts. No screams. Just silence after contact. Panic spread like fire. Eli heard every second of it through the walls. He lay back on his cot and grinned. She was already inside. 2 Drozari guards tried to escort him out. The moment they entered the cell, the lights shorted. A spark erupted behind them. They turned, and something whistled through the air. When they dropped, Eli saw her silhouette standing over them, visor glowing faint red, body armor matte black, streaked with moisture from the vent steam. She deactivated the force field and stepped in. Her voice was low. You all right? Eli stood without hesitation. They didn't touch me. Not really. But I made sure they knew who you were. She nodded once and tossed him a small blaster. Stick close. But don't stay quiet. They moved fast through the ship, navigating hallways filled with sparking wires, unconscious guards, and flickering alarms. Riven's presence was everywhere, like smoke that couldn't be grasped. The slavers tried to regroup at the command bridge, but she didn't give them time. One explosive charge on the side access corridor blew through the main bulkhead, taking down 3 lieutenants. Riven swept in, snapped one neck, shot another in the knee, and had a knife to Kravik's throat before he could form a full sentence. You took my son, she whispered. You broadcast it. Kravik stammered. We didn't know. She cut him off. You did. You just didn't care. He tried to bargain. Credits. Safe passage. Even information about her old squad. She ignored it all and triggered the neural spike she'd implanted in his command chair. He convulsed and collapsed. She turned to Eli. Command logs. Pull them. Eli moved quickly to the console, bypassed encryption with a few commands she didn't expect him to know, and downloaded every file the slavers had collected on him, and her. Riven scanned the data and found something worse than she'd expected. Eli hadn't been taken randomly. Someone had tipped them off. A name flagged in the file wasn't Drozari at all. It was Terran. A name from her past. She stared at it for a long moment. Then she keyed Talon. Prep full burn. We're leaving. But we're not going home. Talon responded. Understood. Shall I forward the data to the Interstellar Tribunal? No. They're compromised too. Eli looked up. So where are we going? She holstered her blade and pulled a second weapon from the wall. Hunting. The Drozari slave frigate drifted like a wounded beast, sparks trailing behind it as systems failed one by one. Where once the halls echoed with barked orders and the shrill tones of auction broadcasts, now there was only smoke, fire, and silence. Kravik's body lay crumpled in the corner of the bridge, still twitching from the neural surge. Riven didn't spare him a second glance. Her focus was on the data Eli had extracted, scrolling through log entries and encrypted communiques while her son stood beside her, face lit by the flickering console screens. The deeper they dug, the more names they uncovered. Coordinates. Slave routes. Holding facilities. Even a payment record, currency transferred from a shadow account traced to someone she once served beside. That revelation stung more than she expected. Not because it shocked her, but because it confirmed what she'd suspected for years. The rot had always been closer than anyone realized. Eli watched her with wide but steady eyes. He didn't speak much. He never had, not when his mind was racing. Riven had seen that same expression on field operatives about to breach a compound. He processed everything without showing it. The difference was, he was 13. And he was already planning how to destroy people who'd hurt others like him. She reached out and placed a hand on his shoulder. He didn't flinch. If anything, he leaned into it, just slightly. She was proud of his courage, but that pride was laced with regret. A part of her had hoped he'd never have to use what she taught him. But here they were, knee-deep in a battlefield, with no turning back. Talon's voice crackled through her comm implant. A scan revealed incoming vessels, 2 in formation, skimming the edge of the asteroid belt. No transponder IDs. No standard flight beacons. They were slaver escorts, likely summoned after the auction broadcast was cut. Talon advised immediate departure, but Riven wasn't finished. She activated the ship's boarding recall and slung the data drive into a hardened case. Eli was already ahead of her, slipping through the smoke-filled corridor back toward the loading bay. She took one last look at the bridge, at the system she'd fried and the captain she'd left twitching, and whispered something under her breath that only the dead could hear. They reached her stealth ship just as the slaver escorts dropped out of silent warp and began powering weapons. Riven and Eli crossed the airlock threshold and sealed the outer hatch seconds before plasma fire scorched the empty hall behind them. Talon rerouted power to defensive plating and launched countermeasures. Riven guided the ship in a sharp vertical break, diving between 2 large asteroids and twisting out of firing range. The frigate behind them lit up as stray fire from its own allies pierced the hull and ignited secondary fuel cells. It erupted in a cascade of violet flames, briefly turning the belt into a light show of wreckage and radiation. Eli turned from the rear viewport. He didn't cheer. He just nodded and said, "Let's go to the next one." The next one, as it turned out, wasn't a ship. It was a station. Hidden beneath the ice rings of a gas giant, the Drozari Syndicate's primary logistics hub was built inside the hollowed remains of a mining colony. That's where the route logs led. Where thousands of names had been processed. Where someone had filed a request to capture a human boy identified as Riven Kale's son. The name tied to the requisition was Garrus Vaughn, former operative, once assigned to Riven's own command team. She remembered him well. Tactical genius. Cold as a vacuum. And now, apparently, a traitor. Talon plotted an intercept course while Riven suited up. This wasn't going to be stealth. Not this time. They needed the records. They needed proof. And she wanted the name spoken aloud from Vaughn's lips before she ended him. Eli was quiet as he prepped gear beside her. He didn't ask questions. He just checked his weapon like he'd been doing it all his life. She almost stopped him, almost told him to wait on the ship. But something in his eyes said he wouldn't. Not now. Not after everything he'd seen. So instead she gave him a small head tilt, the one she used to give her squad when they were cleared to engage. They entered the station at speed, using an outdated maintenance port that hadn't triggered in alarm in years. From there, it was a maze of frost-covered tunnels and ancient lifts. The Drozari hadn't bothered to renovate much. They relied on fear to maintain control. That would be their mistake. Riven moved like a shadow through the dim corridors, disabling sensors with signal bursts and dropping guards with stun knives before they could even gasp. Eli followed without hesitation, stepping over unconscious bodies like he was walking a familiar path. They reached the archive chamber without a single alert. Riven bypassed the biometric lock and entered. Rows of data cores lined the walls, flickering with red and blue status lights. She moved quickly, pulling files, decrypting systems, and isolating every record tied to her son. The name Vaughn came up repeatedly. Purchase orders. Tactical notes. Personal memos detailing how Riven Kale had gone soft, how taking her child would draw her out. He had planned it. Not just to sell a human, but to lure her into the open. He knew her well. Too well. A low beep echoed from behind the console wall. A pressure sensor. Then another. Then footsteps. Riven spun, raising her weapon just as the doors hissed open and Garrus Vaughn stepped through. He hadn't changed much. Same sharp jaw, same hollow expression. He looked at her and gave a half-smile. I wondered how long it would take you. She didn't lower her gun. You made a mistake. Vaughn shrugged. I needed a war to start. You were the fastest way. You used my son. He's still breathing. Better than most we processed. That was the last word he said before Eli stepped out of the shadows and shot him in the leg. Vaughn went down hard, howling in shock. Riven didn't flinch. She watched as her son moved in close and raised the weapon again. But she stopped him with a hand. Not yet. She knelt by Vaughn, stared him down, and asked why. Why betray everything? Vaughn laughed, coughed blood, and whispered, They left us behind. Earth moved on. You're just the last relic. I wanted to prove something. She stood, turned away, and gave Eli a look. Eli nodded once. Then he disabled the final lock on the data archive and sent every encrypted file across deep-wave channels to resistance networks, law enforcement, and public terminals in 27 systems. The evidence would spread faster than the syndicate could scrub it. Every name. Every route. Every buyer. Then he looked down at Vaughn and said the same words his mother had once said to an enemy on Threx 4. You don't get to walk away. They left the station in silence as the charges Eli had planted along the power grid began to tick down. Riven didn't look back. Neither did her son. The blast behind them lit up the gas giant's ring like a rising second sun. The shockwave from the explosion cracked across the ice shelf in jagged patterns, then dispersed into space like a dying breath. Riven's ship adjusted its course automatically, skimming the edge of the blast radius and vanishing into the void without so much as a ripple. Inside, Eli sat on the floor of the weapons bay, arms resting on his knees, face tilted upward in the dim red glow of the emergency lights. He didn't say anything for a long time. Neither did she. There were no cheers. No high fives. No false celebration. The fire they left behind wasn't victory. It was justice paid in full, and it only made them hungrier for the rest. Talon's voice broke the silence with quiet precision. A dozen new names flagged across the galaxy. Syndicate leaders. High-tier buyers. Silent enablers hiding behind fake business fronts and diplomatic status. Riven scanned the list, recognizing a few from old mission files. There was a minister in the Varan League. A retired admiral from the Thaler Front. Even a sitting board member of the Intergalactic Trade Corps. The rot wasn't deep. It was systemic. And now that she had pulled the thread, the entire net was starting to unravel. These weren't petty criminals in backwater systems. These were people with power, shielded by layers of deniability and protected by fleets. But she wasn't after their money or their secrets. She was after fear. The kind that traveled faster than ships and burned deeper than bullets. Eli stood and walked over to the command console. He tapped a few keys, pulling up a visual of the last data dump. The messages were going viral across underground networks. The names they exposed had already been pulled into blacklists. Credit locks were being triggered. Escorts disbanded. In 3 systems, entire ports had shut down, hoping to erase ties before the wave reached them. But it was too late. Riven didn't need a court. She needed the truth to spread. Let the people see what they'd been ignoring. Let them realize how many children had vanished into ships just like the one they destroyed. Eli's fingers moved faster now. He was filtering through asset data, looking for anything that could tie the remaining names to locations. He paused at one entry, then turned to her. "There's a meeting," he said. 2 days from now. An orbital ring above Niros Prime. Syndicate heads are gathering to clean house and disappear before the fallout reaches them. Riven narrowed her eyes. It made sense. They would try to erase the evidence. Shift blame. Kill each other off and dissolve the chain before the links could be used against them. Eli was already pulling blueprints of the ring's security systems. Reinforced shielding. Private shuttles. No external comms. Built to be invisible. But not invulnerable. Riven stared at the image for a long moment. Then she gave a single nod. They would hit it before it began. No speeches. No demands. Just fire and proof that no one who bought children got to feel safe ever again. The next 48 hours passed in silence and preparation. Riven refitted her armor, swapped out worn components, rebalanced her weapons loadout, and reinforced the ship's hull with stealth plating they'd stripped from the Drozari station. Eli trained in the small grav chamber, practicing breach movements and rapid reloads. He wasn't perfect, but he was focused. She saw herself in him more every minute. Not just the skill. The control. The discipline. The weight in his eyes that didn't belong to a boy his age. Talon tracked the movement of the syndicate heads, verifying arrival patterns and shuttle protocols. By the time they reached the Niros Prime orbital ring, the plan was locked. They entered silent drift just beneath the calm shadow of the planet's outer moon, approaching under thermal masks. The station loomed ahead like a glass ring filled with luxury suites and hidden dungeons. From the outside, it looked like a business summit. Inside, it was a conclave of traffickers, brokers, and war criminals dressed in formal wear. The scanners showed bodyguards with high-end disruptors, drones on patrol, and automated turrets guarding each entry vector. Eli leaned over the console, recalculating the approach angles. Riven watched him, letting him lead. He knew the math. He knew the pressure. She just wanted to see what choice he'd make. He turned to her and said, "We go in loud." She smiled. Her kind of language. They bypassed the outer perimeter by latching onto one of the maintenance trams, disabling the operator bot, and rerouting the path into the core of the ring. From there, they moved floor by floor, planting EMP beacons and spike charges on support columns. Every room they passed had another monster behind the door. Sometimes they left them tied and unconscious. Sometimes they didn't. Riven wasn't here to warn. She was here to finish what they started. The final room was a circular hall filled with syndicate heads seated around a long table, watching a projected map of safe exit routes. Eli entered first, tossed a small sphere onto the floor, and ducked behind a pillar. The shockwave shorted out every defense system in the room. Riven walked in behind the static, weapon raised, voice low. "Your names are already out. You're not walking away." One of the leaders stood up and said they had diplomatic immunity. She shot him in the leg. The others froze. She tossed the data drive on the table. It was still broadcasting. Every word they said now was being heard by half the galaxy. One tried to run. Another reached for a hidden weapon. Eli shot the weapon out of his hand without blinking. He said one line that silenced the room. "You chained me because you thought she wouldn't come. You were wrong." Riven walked to the head of the table and activated the final sequence. The beacons detonated in reverse order, blowing out the support ring beneath their feet. The syndicate heads screamed, grabbed for chairs, tumbled sideways as the station lost balance, and rotated into a controlled spin. Talon remotely guided a shuttle into their docking arm just in time for Riven and Eli to board it. They launched as the ring began to collapse in on itself, sparks trailing like meteors. They didn't watch it fall. They had other names to find. Other children to unchain. The ship faded into space, carrying with it the two people the galaxy had tried to forget. But now everyone knew. You don't touch a Kale and expect mercy. You don't take from a mother who once made empires bleed. You don't chain her son. Not if you want to live. The transmission began with no warning, no fanfare, no name attached. Just a blinking signal wave on 100 black market networks and unregulated comm relays, hijacking feeds mid-broadcast. Across spaceports, deep stations, trade channels, and criminal syndicate nodes, the same voice echoed. It was quiet, composed, and unmistakably human. You took children. You branded, sold, and buried them in chains. You thought the galaxy wouldn't care. You thought she was gone. The screen shifted to the image of a boy in chains, then burned to static. In its place came the image of Riven Kale, visor off, eyes sharp, standing beside her son. Her face was calm. Her voice never rose. You chained my son. Now you're all going to pay for it. Across the galaxy, the reaction was instant. Panic spread through slaver corridors, among buyers, handlers, and puppet governments. Syndicate captains abandoned ships. Ports once considered untouchable sealed themselves off. Credits removed, names scrubbed, vessels repainted. It didn't help. Because Riven wasn't hunting money. She was hunting names, faces, blood. And now, those who thought they were shadows found themselves dragged into the light. The broadcast went viral faster than any law enforcement alert ever had. Because it wasn't just information. It was a promise. Riven Kale was back. And this time, she wasn't fighting a war for any government. She was fighting for the ones who had no voice left. On a backwater moon where slavers once ran auctions for rare species, the cages now sat empty. The guards who hadn't fled had been locked inside them. On a former luxury freighter reworked into a prison transport, a dozen traffickers were crammed into holding cells once used for their victims, with a beacon attached to the hull broadcasting their coordinates to every bounty hunter and patrol unit within 10 sectors. On an orbital casino used to launder slave profits, the upper decks were scorched black, and the vaults emptied of anything but names. Riven didn't just destroy. She exposed. Eli helped her send every file, every corrupted registry, every shred of evidence to rebel courts, neutral systems, even former enemies of Earth. There were no more sides in this fight. There was only right and wrong. In one instance, a council member from the neutral planet cluster of Virus Prime received a data packet and laughed it off, until his daughter found the footage on her tablet and asked why he was in the room when those children were crying. He resigned within the hour. On another planet, an elite merchant fleet turned in their own admiral, citing the footage and preemptively severing all ties with his network. No one wanted to be next. No one wanted to be caught looking like they'd been complicit. Fear was spreading faster than weapons ever could. Not because Riven was the strongest. Not because she had the biggest fleet. But because she had the truth. And she had already proven she'd bring it wrapped in fire. Eli had changed. Not in some dramatic, theatrical way. But in quiet ones. He spoke less, but moved with more confidence. He asked sharper questions. When Riven offered him the chance to stop, to leave this life before it consumed him, he didn't hesitate. He simply asked her what came next. And when she said there were more names, he said good. He wasn't doing this just for revenge anymore. He had seen what they'd done to others. He had seen the scope of it. It wasn't about him. It was about everyone who'd been forgotten, sold, discarded. His mother had once been called a weapon. Now he was becoming one too. But not cold. Not emotionless. Focused. A storm that only pointed itself at the guilty. One night, aboard a deep space carrier refitted as a mobile base, Riven stood on the observation deck watching a nearby system spin in slow orbit. She hadn't slept much since they started. She didn't need to. Every time her eyes closed, she saw more names, more files, more scars. She had spent her life in wars she didn't fully believe in. But this one was different. This was the only one that mattered. Eli walked up beside her, holding 2 mugs of synth tea, one of the few things that still reminded them both of home. He handed her a cup and looked out at the stars. She asked him if he was scared. He said he used to be. But not anymore. He said when the slavers took him, he thought no one was coming. He thought maybe she was gone. Or maybe she wasn't the person people used to whisper about. But when she arrived, when she tore through that ship like a force of nature, something in him changed. He realized that monsters weren't invincible. That fear only worked when no one fought back. That sometimes the scariest thing in the galaxy wasn't a giant alien with armor. Sometimes it was a mother who had nothing left to lose. Riven smiled a little at that. Not because it made her feel powerful, but because it reminded her that even now, even after everything, her son still had hope. And that meant she couldn't stop. Not yet. Talon reported a new broadcast source trying to contact them. An anonymous station deep in neutral territory, offering files, coordinates, and the names of corrupt enforcers who helped the slavers operate under radar. Riven authorized the download. She didn't trust it. But she wasn't about to ignore it either. Every lead mattered. Every name was another chain ready to break. Later that week, they arrived at a shadowport orbiting the burned husk of an old mining world. The place was nearly empty, abandoned after one of their prior raids had turned the market upside down. But someone had left a message carved into the steel walls in a dozen languages. It said she walks again. It didn't say her name. It didn't need to. Everyone who mattered already knew. You could see it in the way patrols changed their schedules. The way buyers suddenly turned themselves in hoping for mercy. The way Whisper networks started calling her more than just a soldier. They started calling her judgment. In the final days of the campaign, Eli stood beside his mother as they addressed a rescued group of children taken from 6 different systems. They had no names left. Just ID codes and scars. Riven didn't promise them safety. She didn't tell them everything would be fine. She just told them the ones who hurt them wouldn't be hurting anyone else. And then she gave each of them the chance to choose their own name. Eli watched one girl, no older than him, choose the name Nova. She said it sounded like something that burned bright and left a mark. He smiled at that. As they prepared for their next jump, Talon asked if their mission was complete. Riven didn't answer right away. She looked at her son, at the files still coming in, at the system still harboring quiet evils. Then she said, "We're not finished. Not until there's nowhere left for them to hide." And with that, the ship vanished into deep space once more, leaving only the whisper of her name, and the fear that came with it.